Tonight, when the sun goes down, you're going to flip a switch. Light will flood the room and you won't think twice about it. But for 99.9% of human history, that switch didn't exist. When the sun set, the world went dark, and something in you still remembers what that darkness meant. You felt it. Walking to your car in an empty parking lot at night. Getting up for water and leaving one light off, just to save yourself the walk back. That small flicker of unease when a hallway goes black in your mind, without asking permission, starts filling in what might be standing in it. You tell yourself it's irrational. There's nothing there, you know that. And yet your heart rate climbs anyway. So what is actually happening in your body when the lights go out? And why does a fully modern brain, sitting in a locked house with working locks and a phone in your pocket, still react like something ancient is at the door? Let's go back. Not decades. Not centuries. Millions of years. For most of human evolutionary history, your ancestors lived without any reliable source of light after sunset. No street lamps. No flashlights. No moon guaranteed to be full. Just firelight, when fire was available, and otherwise, total darkness for roughly half of every single day. And darkness back then wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous in a very specific way. Large predators, the kind capable of killing a human, are disproportionately active at night. Big cats, hyenas, various now extinct megafauna that once shared the landscape with early hominins. These animals had eyes built for low light. Humans did not. Anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist David Barish has written extensively about how human fear responses map almost perfectly onto the actual predation risks our ancestors faced. Fear of the dark, according to this research, isn't a glitch. It's a feature. A brain that felt nothing at night, that walked calmly past a rustling bush in pitch blackness, was a brain far more likely to end up as dinner. Think about what that means for a second. The version of humanity that survived long enough to become your ancestors wasn't the version that felt safe in the dark. It was the version that felt afraid enough to stay near the fire, to freeze at unfamiliar sounds, to treat darkness as a genuine threat until proven otherwise. Fear wasn't a weakness passed down to you by accident. It was a survival tool, refined over countless generations of exactly the people who didn't ignore it. So when your pulse quickens in a dark room today, that's not malfunction, that's an inheritance. Here's where it gets more specific, and slightly stranger. Researcher Daniel Kelly and colleagues who study the psychology of disgust and fear have pointed to something called the smoke detector principle, a concept developed by evolutionary psychologist Randolph Ness. The idea is simple. Evolution tends to overtune fear responses rather than undertune them, because the cost of a false alarm, your heart racing over nothing, is small, while the cost of a missed real threat, an actual predator you failed to notice, is potentially fatal. Given that trade-off, natural selection consistently favors the nervous system that jumps at shadows over the one that calmly investigates them. That's why an empty hallway can spike your heart rate even though you logically know it's empty. Your nervous system isn't calculating probability. It's running an ancient, deliberately oversensitive alarm system that would rather be wrong 1,000 times than miss the one time it mattered. Isn't it strange that the exact same wiring keeping you anxious about a dark closet is the wiring that kept your ancestors alive long enough to have you at all? Consider how differently this plays out depending on where you are. In your own bedroom, familiar and mapped out in your memory, darkness barely registers as a problem. You know exactly where the furniture is. You know the door is 3 steps to the left. But drop that same nervous system into an unfamiliar dark space, a strange hotel room, an unlit trail, a basement you've never been in, and the anxiety spikes noticeably higher. That difference tells you something important. It was never really about the absence of light. It was about the absence of certainty, and familiarity is one of the few things that can substitute for actual visual information. There's a physical mechanism behind this too, and it starts with your eyes. Human vision is heavily optimized for daylight. Your retina contains 2 types of light-sensing cells, rods and cones. Cones handle color and detail but require substantial light to function. Rods handle low-light vision but see only in shades of gray and can't resolve fine detail. In darkness, you're essentially seeing through a much blurrier, colorless, lower-resolution version of your own eyes. This matters because your brain hates ambiguity, especially ambiguity involving potential threats. In daylight, a coat hanging on a door is obviously a coat. In darkness, your rod-dominated vision blurs its edges, and your brain, running that same overtuned threat detection system, sometimes fills in the gap with something worse. A shape. A figure. Movement that isn't actually there. This is why so many people report seeing something out of the corner of their eye at night that vanishes the moment a light comes on. Your brain wasn't lying to you. It was doing exactly what it evolved to do. guessing dangerous rather than guessing safe, whenever the visual evidence ran out. There's also a well-documented developmental pattern here that says something important. Fear of the dark tends to emerge in children around the age of 2, right around the time they start being physically capable of wandering away from a caregiver on their own. Developmental psychologists have noted that this timing isn't a coincidence. A toddler who can now walk independently, but who has no ability to defend itself, benefits enormously from a built-in caution around darkness and separation. The fear shows up exactly when the vulnerability does, which means this isn't something culture taught you as a child through scary stories and monster movies. Those stories tap into something that was already sitting there, waiting to be activated. The fear came first. The stories came later, built on top of it. Psychologist Graham Davey, who has studied childhood fear development for years, has pointed out that most so-called irrational fears in children actually cluster around a small set of ancestrally relevant categories: darkness, heights, certain animals, strangers, and separation from a caregiver. Almost none of them cluster around genuinely modern dangers. Children are not born with an instinctive fear of electrical outlets or moving cars, the things statistically most likely to actually harm them today. They're born wired to fear the exact hazards that would have threatened a small, defenseless primate several 100,000 years ago. Your nervous system, in other words, was assembled for a world that no longer exists, and it hasn't caught up. Speaking of stories, here's the modern mirror worth sitting with. Every culture on record, without exception, has folklore about what lurks in darkness. Every single one. Different continents, different centuries, completely different belief systems, and yet somehow they all independently produce their own version of the same warning. Something bad happens after dark, so stay close to the light. That kind of universal convergence doesn't usually happen by coincidence. When wildly different human societies, with no contact with one another, keep landing on the exact same core idea, it's usually because that idea is describing something real about being human, not something specific to any one culture. In this case, what it's describing is a nervous system tuned by millions of years of nighttime predation, dressed up in local costume as whatever monster a given culture found most frightening. Now here's the part that should genuinely reframe how you think about your own reaction tonight. Your fear of the dark isn't really about darkness itself. Darkness is just the condition. What you're actually afraid of is uncertainty, the specific kind of uncertainty that comes from losing your primary sense for detecting threats. Humans are overwhelmingly visual creatures. Take away sight, even partially, and your brain treats it the same way it would treat losing radar. Suddenly you can't verify what's safe, so your threat detection system defaults to assuming the worst, because assuming the worst used to be the only strategy that kept your ancestors alive long enough to reproduce. This is also why the fear fades so quickly once light returns. It's not that the threat was ever resolved through reasoning. It's that your visual system came back online and confirmed, instantly and directly, that nothing was actually there. Light doesn't calm you down by teaching you something new. It calms you down by giving your ancient alarm system the one thing it was built to respond to: visual confirmation of safety. So think again about that moment at the light switch tonight. When you flip it and the room floods with light, you're not just seeing better. You're closing a loop that your nervous system has been running, in some form, for millions of years. Darkness triggers the alarm. Light resolves it. On, off, playing out exactly the same way it did for a distant ancestor standing at the edge of firelight, watching the tree line, waiting to see if the rustling in the bushes was wind or something worse. You are not broken for flinching at shadows. You are not being irrational when your heart rate climbs in an unfamiliar dark room, even in a locked house, even with a phone full of light in your pocket. You are running a system that was built under conditions where hesitation could mean death and paranoia could mean survival. And that system has not had nearly enough generations to update itself for streetlights and smartphone flashlights. Evolution moves slowly. Technology moves fast. You're living in the gap between the two, carrying a Stone Age alarm system through a world it was never built for. One that still treats every dark hallway like it might be hiding the same predator your ancestors spent a million years learning to fear. And there's a reason this gap hasn't closed, even after thousands of years of artificial light. Genetic change requires many generations to spread through a population, and reliable, affordable lighting has only existed for a tiny sliver of human history, really just the last century or two in most parts of the world. Measured against the timescale evolution actually operates on, electric light arrived essentially yesterday. Your body hasn't had remotely enough time to unlearn a fear response that took hundreds of thousands of years to build in the first place. You are, quite literally, ahead of your own biology. That's worth remembering the next time you catch yourself feeling a little embarrassed about being nervous in the dark, checking a closet before bed, or turning on every light in the house when you're home alone. That reaction isn't a personal flaw. It's not something wrong with you specifically. It's the shared inheritance of every human who has ever lived, expressed in a body that happens to exist in an era with light switches instead of firelight. So tonight, when the sun goes down and you flip that switch without thinking twice, know what you're really doing. You're not just turning on a light. You're finishing a routine your ancestors started at the edge of a fire a million years ago. The same nervous alertness, the same relief when the light finally comes back, playing out one more time in a body that has never quite stopped listening for what might be waiting in the dark.